Yes, ladies and gentlemen, we're now ready to start the session. Well, we are indeed thrilled by the fact that thanks to the support from all around the world, we are celebrating the 10th anniversary this year. So in order to look back to our memories and to foresee the future, we have prepared a clip. So why don't we watch the video through the screen?
안녕하십니까. 39대 국방부 차관 이용걸입니다. 먼저 서울안보대학 10주년을 축하드립니다. 서울안보대학은 창설시 창급 협의체로서 그 성공 및 지속 가능성에 대한 많은 고민이 있었는데 이렇게 성공적으로 10년을 이끌어오신 국방부 및 관계기관 모든 분께 감사드립니다. 앞으로도 서울안보대학가 다정한 협력을 통한 지역 평화체제 구축에 크게 기여하길 바랍니다. 감사합니다.
Hello everyone, I'm Jody Thomas, the Deputy Minister of Canada's Department of National Defence. Over the years, the Seoul Defence Dialogue has been an important opportunity for Canada and our like-minded partners and allies to connect and discuss critical issues for the region and the world. On its 10th anniversary, and on behalf of Canada's defence team, congratulations to all who've worked so hard to make this important international dialogue possible. And we look forward to the dialogue's continued growth and evolution in the years to come. Thanks for all your great work to advance global peace and security.
SDD began in the hope of establishing peace on the Korean Peninsula and promoting security cooperation in the Asia-Pacific. For the past decade, security experts from around 60 countries have discussed global security challenges. Also, SDD has promoted defense exchange and cooperation through numerous bilateral and small multilateral meetings. SDD has grown a renown to be multilateral security dialogue over the past 10 years. SDD will step up as a global multilateral security dialogue.
Yes, well, the video has well depicted the SDD's growth over the last 10 years. From the initial edition until the 10, it has grown very far, but however, there's a lot to be achieved. So it's for the SDD to grow further. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a big round of applause. Thank you very much. Now we will be beginning the special dialogue entitled The 10th Anniversary of Seoul Defense Dialogue, Achievements and Prospects of Multilateral Cooperation. Well, we will be beginning with, of course, the talk from our chairman here. We will be also providing the Korea-English simultaneous interpretation, so please listen to your receivers. Now, let's welcome to the stage the chairman, Chung-in of the Sejong Institute. Please give him a big round of applause. So today, with the chairman Moon Chung-in of the Sejong Institute, we will have the distinguished honorary professor Gareth Evans joining us as the panelist. After the discussion, we will be having the Q&A session as well, welcoming all the people from the floor as well as online to share their thoughts that could be dealt here on stage as well. So if you have a burning question that you have to ask dear participants online, please write them down through the chatting box. And now I will pass the mic upon to our chairman here. Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me as the chair of this wonderful session. And I learned a lot from the video material that the Seoul Defense Dialogue has achieved a lot of things in the past 10 years. Today, the setting will be this, Minister Gareth Evans prepared very nice written material on this, on the idea of multilateral security cooperation. Therefore, you can make reference of that material. But Minister Evans wanted to have a more dialogue than his straightforward lecture. Therefore, after I give a brief introduction, and I'll be asking questions to Minister Evans, and he'll be responding to us. And we'll have about 30 to 40 minutes, and after that, we'll open to the floor. And that was also a request of Minister Evans. He wanted to hear from the floor as well as from the online, and he wanted to respond to your questions and comments. And before I start, dialogue with Minister Evans, let me just briefly introduce about Professor, Gareth Evans. He has many titles, professor, whatever. But he served as Foreign Minister of Australia for 8 years. Prior to that, he served as the Minister of Justice of Australia for 2 years. And during his position as Foreign Minister of Australia, he achieved a lot of things. For example, he was one of the leaders of introducing R2P, Right to Protect, at the United Nations. And he was also the man behind the Asian Regional Forum. Okay? And, even though he was a Minister of Australia, he engineered a lot of multilateral diplomatic and defense dialogue in the Asia Pacific. And also, he was Chancellor of Australian National University, and he is currently chairman and the founder of Asia Pacific Leadership Network for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament. He has been very, very active in the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons too. Therefore, he has a lot of imaginative ideas. He is extremely passionate, and he is extremely devoted to common causes of the world. And it is a great honor for us to invite Professor and former Minister Gareth Evans as today's guest. Let us give a big applause to him. But as you all know, that the Republic of Korea is a staunch ally of the United States. Therefore, alliance has become a very important part of our defense diplomacy. But 10 years ago, our Minister of National Defense has been shifting focus to other areas too, because we have a traditional security area, such as military security. But as today's conference's theme suggests, we now have a lot of borderless threats, so-called the new security agenda, okay, which cannot be dealt with by a single country or with just simple alliance. We need international cooperation to deal with those kinds of new security threat. Pandemic is one thing, climate change, refugees, human security, you name it. There are a myriad of new security issues that threaten the very survival of humankind. And for that kind of new threat, we need to have more cooperative approach. In fact, Professor Evans wrote a book called Cooperation for Security as early as in 1993. Therefore, he's the right person to address those kinds of issues. But with this brief background, therefore, in other words, agenda has been changing, and Ministry of National Defense has been responding to changing agenda. Alliance is a very important part of our defense diplomacy, but our Ministry of National Defense thinks that we should go beyond the traditional security. In the new security areas, we need cooperation. We need not only bilateral cooperation, we need multilateral cooperation. And on the occasion of 10th anniversary of Seoul Defense Dialogue, we wanted to really examine what the Seoul Defense Dialogue has achieved, what are the constraints, what are limits, okay? What should be the prospect, okay? With that background, let me start asking questions to Professor Evans. Gareth, what did you take of Seoul Defense Dialogue? Boys. 소리가 안 나오네.
Are you hearing me now?
Now I
Is that
do.
better?
Yes.
Okay, well, Chairman Moon, Professor Moon, Dr. Moon, but may I call you Chung-in if you could promise to call me Gareth. It's a very great pleasure to join you and all your colleagues here on this 10th anniversary meeting of the Seoul Defense Dialogue. And the SDD has been around for a decade and I think has definitely made an impression. Perhaps it might be sensible to begin by just sort of exploring where it fits in within the wider landscape of multilateral security dialogues, which fall into three categories, basically, as you're probably more aware than most. I mean, first of all, there are track one dialogues, those taking place at a purely governmental level, involving ministers or senior officials or both. The major ones are the East Asia Summit at leadership level, and at ministerial level, as you mentioned, the ASEAN Regional Forum, which has been going since 1994. And there are a number of other ASEAN Plus meetings. They're the ones with a solely security-focused agenda. In addition, of course, there's the APEC leaders meeting, which is overwhelmingly economically focused and formally economically focused, but does deal periodically with a number of volatile security issues in the margins of that meeting. The second category is the track 1.5 meetings, and that's where the Seoul Defense Dialogue squarely fits in. These are meetings, dialogue meetings, involving a mix of senior government figures together with non-government experts. I guess the longest established and probably still best known of these track 1.5 dialogues is the Shangri-La dialogue, and I know you want to spend a little time comparing the SDD's effectiveness with that of Shangri-La, but it's also where the Shangshan Forum, which Beijing established a few years ago as a competitor to Shangri-La, fits in. And the third category of these dialogue organizations or dialogue forums are the so-called track 2 forums, which are those involving primarily non-government participants, think tanks, academics, former high-level officials, NGOs, sometimes business leaders as well. Former government or government leaders do very often come and address these conferences as keynote speakers and so on, but the dialogue is essentially at a non-governmental level. There's a few of these around the place. Probably the most influential, one of the most influential of them is clearly the Jeju Forum, with which you, Chung-in, have been deeply associated, and as have I in recent years, which is an outstanding example of a multi-track track 2 dialogue addressing many security along with other issues. Probably most influential in that context has been CSCAP, the Council for Security Cooperation in the Asia Pacific, which has been going a very long time, since the 90s, bringing together security-focused academics and think tanks in meetings and in associated policy groups. I guess what all these dialogue forums, including the Seoul Defense Dialogue, have in common is two basic objectives. There are substantive objectives and there are process objectives. Substantively, these forums, your forum, others as well, all seek to make a significant contribution to policy making, to be vehicles for identifying and analysing security problems, current ones, emerging ones, potential ones, as vehicles for giving the occasion for national positions, national perspectives to be articulated, and also providing a vehicle for identifying possible common solutions. That's the substantive side. The process side, which is probably in many ways even more important, is to, through direct contact, physical contact, which is obviously very difficult in a pandemic environment like now, and to build mutual trust and confidence among their participants on the principle that personal relationships are really very often the lubricant on which really effective international as well as domestic policy making depends. I think just looking at the SDT very briefly from what I know of it, it really has done an excellent job in establishing itself in just a decade as a key track 1.5 security dialogue forum, hosted as it is by the Ministry for National Defence, with very strong governmental participation at vice ministerial level, with Northeast Asia as its primary, but of course not its only focus. The growth in participation, which has been mentioned already in the introduction, has been really quite extraordinary, with, as I understand, the first meeting in 2012, bringing together just 100 people from 15 countries, but more recently you've had 600 or more participants from 48 countries. And this is indeed a forum that policymakers want to attend. The reports of meetings that I've read indicate very wide-ranging and informative discussions on a lot of different themes. But as always, it's difficult to know how much influence they have on actual governmental decision making. And I guess you're, Chung-in, in a better position than I am to make that judgment. But I guess we'll move on to discuss the impact and comparisons with other bodies in a moment.
As you pointed out, in the Seoul Defense Dialogue has done an excellent job, but it has not gaining a lot of popularity and media attention. Meanwhile, the Shangri-La Dialogue has been gaining all kinds of attention. Of course, the presence of incumbent defense ministers and etc. I mean, how would you compare, Seoul Defense Dialogue with the Shangri-La Dialogue, and what are the determinants of the success of the Shangri-La Dialogue?
Well, the Shangri-La Dialogue's been going a lot longer, and that gives it a head start, I guess. It's also been very effective at promoting itself as the premier dialogue outfit in the Asia Pacific. It's not been at all modest, not been at all backward in the way in which it's articulated its contribution. But I think it's probably fair to say that one of the reasons that it has been more visible and in some ways, having more of an impact is that the way it's actually constructed. I mean, it is hosted by a non-government organisation, the IISS, International Institute for International Security, rather than a formal governmental organisation. And that gives it the chance to be a little less formal, I guess, in the way in which it conducts itself. Its website actually describes this as being run by an NGO rather than by government. It enables it says, to create a discursive space which enables ministers to discuss security problems considered too sensitive for more formal policy-making forums, which retains all the political legitimacy and authority of a formal process without the usual constraints of Asian diplomatic norms. Well, it may just be that SDD, so Seoul Dialogue, hosted as it is by the Ministry of National Defence, will find it a little bit more difficult to escape some of that formality. But my personal view is that it should certainly try, and that if it does, it will have a more obviously visible impact. I think in my experience, which goes back quite a few decades now, dialogue forums are always more informative and more stimulating when the emphasis is on serious and extended interaction between participants, rather than essentially just set-piece presentations with minimal opportunities for Q&A and an exchange between panelists or with the audience. I think they're most effective when the session topics clearly focus on issues on which opinion is clearly divided, where there's no common consensus at all. For example, Chinese geopolitical ambitions, the US response to them, how to deal with North Korea. Sessions are most successful, again, uh, if not discussing highly volatile contemporary issues, discussing issues which are either new or too little explored. And I think some of the issues associated with new technology in a defence as well as a larger context are probably in that category. I think dialogue sessions, exchanges like this are more effective when keynote speakers and panelists are encouraged to be clear and articulate about areas of real difficulty, areas of real sensitivity, rather than just fudging them in order not to offend anyone's sensitivities. And offering, of course, in the process, constructive suggestions about problem solving. Those sort of characteristics have often been visible in the Shangri-La dialogue. There's been some quite volatile and very lively, very robust exchanges. I remember the ones particularly in 2019 that encouraged a lot of attention when both the US and Chinese defense secretaries sort of went hammer and tongs at each other in separate panels, but nonetheless making very clear the extent of their differences. And I guess if that were to happen now, that would be an even more robust exchange. So I, as a regular consumer, can I just say finally in this context of many of these sorts of meetings over many decades, my own personal criteria for success have really been threefold. Whether my attention is engaged throughout each session or whether I'm tempted to reach for my iPhone and catch up with my emails and texts. Secondly, whether I've learned at least one new fact. And it is extraordinary how many of these occasions people just repeat the old familiar stuff without exploring new ground. And also my third criterion for success, I guess, is whether I've heard at least one new policy idea and been forced to think about something that's a little bit outside perhaps my comfort zone. Maybe that's too high a set of bars for most forum organisers to be able to meet most of the time, but one does live in hope. And I think there's every potential for the Seoul Defence Dialogue to be a really significant vehicle, focusing as it particularly does on Northeast Asian type issues. And I think maybe just loosening up a little bit the formats, encouraging a bit more direct interaction rather than set-piece speeches is the key to getting people's attention and to getting them wanting to become really engaged. But maybe I'm being unfair. You've been around to more of these meetings than I have. What's your own view, Chung-in, about?
No, because, for example, with regard to Shangri-La dialogue, I remember who attended the Shangri-La dialogue, but I do not remember what agenda was there, what kinds of output was there. Therefore, what really matters is who shows up at the Shangri-La dialogue. When American Defense Secretary, Chinese Defense Minister, Korean Defense Minister show up in Singapore, then they begin draw attention, media attention, and public attention. Therefore, I would the success of this kind of dialogue is a function of a visibility of participants. Therefore, I would say that the Seoul Defense Dialogue has failed to secure that kind of high-profile public figures. That is one reason. Maybe that has something to do with role of IISS, International Institute for Strategic Studies of London, has been the key organizer of Shangri-La Dialogue. And IISS has very good connections with the United States and European countries, even China. And I think that is one of the reasons why the Shangri-La Dialogue has been very successful. For example, if you go back to Shangshan Dialogue in Beijing, that is done by the PLA, People's Liberation Army, but that is mostly organized by the Beijing University, Wang Jisi, and some others. Okay, but in terms of visibility, Shangshan Dialogue is no comparison with the Shangri-La Dialogue. Therefore, in other words.
Yeah,
yes, please go ahead.
But Chung-in, look, it's not just about show business. I mean, the dialogue sessions that generate the most attention are those which are attended by leaders and full hooplas of delegations and big speeches that just have to generate some attention because of who's giving them. But your experience and mine must very often be that when it comes to actual policy impact, when it comes to generating new thinking, when it comes to people reaching actual agreement, around the table about new approaches to difficult, intractable problems. Very often, these big, glittering occasions are really, really pretty empty. You can all be familiar. You'll all remember those sorts of occasions when, what it's about is just, photo opportunities and people making very tedious set-piece speeches, supporting previously negotiated lowest common denominator communiques. So what really matters is the substance, I think, if you're looking for policy impact. And that depends on the kind of stimulation that the participants get out of the occasion. Again, ministerial meetings, the same as leader level meetings, the same. We talked a little bit before about the ASEAN Regional Forum, which I did have a role in establishing back in 1994. That was intended to have a really substantial impact over time, evolving from just a purely dialogue, confidence building sort of organization to one that was genuinely engaged in conflict prevention and management and resolution of really difficult and intractable issues. And for a while it looked as if that was the way that was going to develop, with some quite serious discussion around a code of conduct in the South China Sea, some real dialogue on issues like counterterrorism, transnational crime, some useful agreements on disaster relief and so on. But over time, it's just dwindled away into, really, I have to say, and I'm very disappointed about this, a lot of irrelevance, because again, it's just been the sort of set-piece speech making, the lowest common denominator communiques, the photo opportunities without the substance. Very often, you just get better substance at a less exalted level. You might not get as much newspaper attention, television attention, social media attention, but if the discussions, if the debates are really lively, if they're generating new information, new thinking, and generating the real sense of engagement by their participants, they can be very, very worthwhile indeed. So, and what goes on around the edges of these things? It's very difficult in a pandemic when there's minimal physical attendance and everybody's just doing this on screen. It's not very satisfactory at all. But the kind of exchanges that you can have around the edges of these conferences, the interactions you can have with other people, particularly other countries, other cultures, other disciplines, can be incredibly stimulating. But it needs an agenda for the sessions, which is itself lively, which is willing to address controversial issues, and it requires, the time for issues to be effectively exposed in debate on the platform, rather than just, forcing people to sit like rows of ducks listening to formal presentations.
I agree with you. Really, the raison d'etre of this kind of dialogue is to generate a new debate and new policy issues, and also shape the interactions among key intellectuals and policymakers, and coming up with a set of solutions, ideas, and suggestions with certain kinds of policy impact. But nowadays, partly because of pandemic, we do not have interactions, and partly because of emphasis on the formality, we have failed to produce that kinds of outcomes. But when we talk about the security cooperation...
I'll just interrupt there and ask you, is formality absolutely inevitable in an Asian context? It's not inevitable in Anglo-Saxon contexts, and we're sometimes regarded as very rude and crude and difficult and to get on with as a result. But in an Asian context, it seems to me that a bit more interactivity, volatility. You yourself are pretty good at this sort of stuff, but it does seem to be a bit of a cultural inhibition. Are we condemned forever to have that in an Asian context?
Yeah, go back to Aristotle. He said the form and matter, really, formality as well as substance matter. We need to have a balance between the two. But in today's, these kinds of multilateral dialogues, we tend to pay more attention to formality and media attention and public attention than on the substances, okay, and policy impact. Therefore, we need to balance between the two. But here, we are talking about the security cooperation, multilateral security cooperation, that we have two contending paradigms. One paradigm is collective defense system. Alliance matters. NATO is a good example, okay? And it assumes a common enemy, okay? Common threat. In order to deal with the common enemy and common threat, we should cooperate in security domain. There is one paradigm. United States is the leader of that paradigm. Another paradigm is collective security system, which is embedded in UN charters. There are no such a thing as a common enemy and common threat. We are members of security community. But if a member of our security community invade other members of community, we come up with a collective punishment, okay? And that in that way, we can assure collective security. China tends to favor this collective security idea. We clearly see tension between the two. Nowadays, the United States is even talking about the Asian NATO. And some people argue that Quad, quadrilateral dialogue is kind of stepping stone toward the Asian version of NATO and etc. Chinese are extremely sensitive to that idea. Now, what is your take on this kind of paradigmatic contestation between the United States and China? And what should be the direction of our multilateral security cooperation dialogue?
Well, there are, as you say, two basic paradigms here. There's the collective defense paradigm, which is essentially a squarely militarily focused organizational arrangement where the participants, where the members of the collective do agree, commit themselves to assisting a member who's under attack from someone else. The classic NATO example, as you say. Then there's the much looser collective security framework that you identify, which can have and quite an important military component. But the United Nations is the classic example. It does have the potential for military engagement through Security Council endorsement of military action and so on. But it's a much broader enterprise than that. And my instinct is that the future in Asia for all of us lies in efforts to create a much more attentive environment for collective security rather than collective defence, with much less focus on the military dimension. Of course, we all have to get our national defence houses in order. Nobody doubts the necessity to prepare for worst-case contingencies, to prepare to plan on the basis of other people's potential adversaries' capability, not their current or likely intent. True. But if we really want peace, if we really want to avoid getting caught up in situations where we're going to have to use that military capability, far, far more important to focus our attention on developing these collective security arrangements, of which there are none really existing at all in the Asia-Pacific, Indo-Pacific environment. There's a few collective defence arrangements, the most obvious one still being ANZUS, in which Australia has itself caught up with the United States and to a lesser extent New Zealand. And of course, there is some enthusiasm in some quarters, as you say, to get the quadrilateral arrangement now between the United States, India, Japan and Australia, moving towards a more formal defence arrangement, which is certainly not at the moment. What it is at the moment is an exercise in signalling to China that if it does overreach, as frankly it has been doing in the South China Sea and elsewhere, there are plenty of countries with quite strong capability in the region that are capable and able to and willing to push back. It's a signalling exercise at this stage rather than a substantive collective defence operation. It's a signalling enterprise, incidentally, in which I'd be very interested to know, you don't sound very enthusiastic about it yourself, but I'd be interested to know whether South Korea does have an interest in eventually participating and turning the Quad into a quint, and maybe we can come back to that. But look, let me just finish by developing a little further this idea of the focus being on the collective security paradigm rather than the collective defence, on the less military focused. Collective security is not the only language for describing this. I actually quite prefer the concept of cooperative security, which is built on three different notions: traditional collective security, the notion of common security, which goes back to the Olive Palmer Commission back in the 80s, the idea that you build your defence, you create your defence with others rather than against them. And it also owes something to the idea of comprehensive security, which is that security is not just about the hard edge stuff. It's about economic and social dynamics and the need to get all those dimensions working in harmony together. But the idea of cooperative security, which I actually developed in that book that you mentioned called Cooperating for Peace, which I wrote back in the early 90s, which unfortunately is still very relevant today because very few of its prescriptions have been adopted by the United Nations or anyone else. But I described cooperative security then in these terms as a broad approach to security, which is multidimensional in scope and gradualist in temperament, which emphasizes reassurance rather than deterrence, which is inclusive rather than exclusive, which is not restrictive in its membership, which favors multilateralism over bilateralism, does not privilege military solutions over non-military ones, assumes that states are principal actors in the security system, but there are non-state actors who may have an important role to play, doesn't require the establishment of formal security institutions, but doesn't reject them either, and which above all stresses the value of creating habits of dialogue on a multilateral basis. And what I would really emphasize in that, and we can argue about terminology, we can argue about definitions, we can argue about which is the parent concept and which are the subsidiary ones, but I think running through all these ideas of collective security, of cooperative security, of comprehensive security, and common security is this notion that developing habits of dialogue between potential adversaries as well as between friends are incredibly important if you are going to avoid, worst case military scenarios evolving. And I have to say again, in that context, that the Seoul Defence Dialogue is particularly well placed to engage in the business of encouraging and developing those habits of multilateral dialogue. So I think you and I are on the same page here. A lot of our defence establishments are not. They love their hardware. They regard diplomacy as all being a bit soft and a bit irrelevant and not the main game. But frankly, with the world is as it is at the moment, with so many of those transnational problems, that no country can solve by itself, that require cooperation for their solution, being centre front in our concerns at the moment, including the big existential risks, the three great existential risks of climate change, pandemics, and nuclear holocaust. None of these things could be done, by the big guys alone or bilaterally. They can only be done cooperatively. They can only be done effectively multilaterally. So that's why this approach that you favour, that I favour, really does, I think, deserve far more sympathetic attention than it's been getting, and that's why dialogue forums like this are so important.
But then we have a kind of existential dilemma here. You made a very clear point that cooperating for security requires non-exclusivity, okay? But in the case for South Korea, in order to maintain alliance with the United States, we should accept the selective exclusivity, okay? How should we resolve that problem, okay? Particularly with regard to China.
Well, nobody wants a zero-sum game with China where we're making choices. We don't want to have to make choices. We want to be able to work both sides of the fence. That's certainly very, very true of Australia, notwithstanding all the strife that we're in with China at the moment, as a result of offending them on multiple fronts, sometimes with cause, sometimes without cause. I think the reality is we just have to get along, and we can't let our alliance relationships, ours with America, yours with America, we can't let these completely dominate and influence and determine our policy responses, because we're the meats in the sandwich here. We're the ones that live in the neighbourhood, that depend hugely economically on these relationships, and really need to find a way of coexisting. I mean, part of the task for us, we US allies, we so-called umbrella states who think we benefit from nuclear deterrence of the United States, I think just have to persuade the United States to be just a little bit more careful in the way in which it articulates these issues. I mean, so many American policymakers still use, whether they believe it or not, they still use publicly the P words: primacy, predominance, preeminence, this insistence on American. I don't mind the idea of American leadership. That's going to be with us for a long time. But, you know, what we're talking about in the world that now exists with China is the absolute necessity for coexistence, the absolute necessity for stepping back and allowing some space for this new very big guy on the block to assert its own identity, to be, you know, something of a rule maker internationally as well as a rule taker. Now, so much of Chinese behavior recently has been so provocative and so difficult that it's not easy to step back from these kinds of assertions. But I think we must, because all these things feed into each other. And if you've got this American insistence, you know, on being top dog on the global bloc in perpetuity, then it's going to be very difficult for China not only to get along with America sort of bilaterally, but also for China to be a cooperative player in those multilateral environments where, you know, the US and China are seen to be head-butting. You've heard me use this quote before, but I really do think it's remains incredibly salient, and it's something that I heard Bill Clinton say a couple of years after he left the presidency. It was at a private meeting, and what he said was, look, and this was way back in the early 2000s. What he said was this: that look, America's got two choices about the way in which we use this great and unrivaled economic and military supremacy that we now have. We can use this huge and unrivaled, unprecedented power to try to stay top dog on the global bloc in perpetuity. Or, and this was clearly his preference, or he said, we can use that great and unrivaled economic and military power to create a world in which we are comfortable living when we are no longer top dog on the global bloc. Now, the difficulty is that, I mean, he wouldn't say that publicly, he never did. And it's difficult to this day to imagine any American leader saying that. The political imperatives, the America First stuff is, you know, under Trump, the prospects of its renewal in the future have made life, you know, very difficult for anyone who wants to bring a sort of a balanced approach to this. But I think it is important for allies of the United States, you know, like South Korea, like Australia, like Japan, like the East and Central Europeans, NATO allies more generally. I think it is important for us to give that message to the US that the only future for all of us is not a confrontational future, it's a cooperative future. And they've got to themselves help create the environment for that future, not only by their actions, but by their words, because, you know, words in diplomacy can be bullets, and that primacy language can be very counterproductive. I don't know, do you share that view, or am I overstating it?
No, I agree with you. Even, you know, you are liberal, that you are emphasizing coexistence. That's exactly understandable. But if you,
but you're somebody said the other day, you're the liberal Kissinger.
Listen to, you know, Dr. Henry Kissinger. He's a classic realist. He's also emphasizing the importance of coexistence. But we have, you know, leading liberal like you and leading realist like Dr. Kissinger. They're all emphasizing peaceful coexistence between China and the United States. But those pundits in Washington, those pundits in Beijing, they are getting into different direction, opposite direction. But here, let me ask one more question. If you look at the Biden administration policy in China, it has three dimensions. First dimension is cooperative dimension. President Biden made it very clear. I wanted to cooperate with China on pandemics, climate change, proliferation of nuclear weapons. And then he also said that on the issue of trade and technology, we will extremely competing with China, extreme competition. And as to geopolitics and values issues, such as human rights and democracy in Hong Kong and Uyghur, and will pursue confrontational policy with China. We see three kind of conflicting images of American foreign policy. But my puzzle is this: if the United States pursues confrontational policy on geopolitics and human rights and democracy, how can they forge cooperation with China on new security issues such as the pandemic, climate change, and nuclear weapons?
Well, as someone once famously wrote, a Labour politician in the UK in the 1930s, if you can't ride two horses at once, you shouldn't be in the circus. So maybe, just maybe, you do have to have that duality or triadic approach to the conduct of a relationship. I've actually got some sympathy for that articulated Biden position. And provided it is actually sought to be implemented seriously in practice, then I think probably it is the way forward. There are going to be a number of issues which are just going to be intractable in terms of the bilateral relationship and indeed, our relationship as US allies, as regional players with China. And we can't just turn a completely blind eye to the aggression in the South China Sea. We can't turn a completely blind eye to what's going on internally in Xinjiang and so on with Hong Kong. And we're going to have to go on being difficult with China and making very clear that we think it's not in China's interest to go on behaving that way. But I think if we really, really focus our efforts on finding areas of potential common ground, those regional and global public goods issues, which are incapable, as everyone knows, of resolution except through cooperation. And if we focus our attention particularly on what everyone really does acknowledge to be the three great existential risks of our time, putting at risk life on this planet as we know it, pandemics, obviously climate change, and equally obviously potential for nuclear holocaust. If we just focus on those issues and try really seriously to find common ground, I think we'll find that, and particularly if we moderate collectively some of our rhetoric and don't play as much into those domestic political constituencies which are constantly urging escalation of the rhetoric, if we do all that and really focus on finding some common ground, with one of the first priorities being the Glasgow Climate Conference that's coming up, then I think there is some potential for moving forward. It's complex, it's difficult, but foreign policy is always complex and difficult. There was that halcyon period that I remember well was when I was foreign minister in the early 90s, when it seemed like anything was possible. Such was the sense of cooperation and such was the willingness to address collectively these issues and not to apply political vetoes in the Security Council and elsewhere. Yes, things were different then to what they are now, but there's still an absolute imperative for the sake of not just good policy, but for our very existence, for there to be cooperation around those big issues. So I would, and I don't think China's excluded that. The recent conversations with John Kerry were obviously not very productive, the first exchanges on the climate issue. But I think we ought to be pushing very hard. And similarly on the nuclear issue, about which you and I are, as you said, very passionate as key members of the Asia-Pacific Leadership Network on nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament. I think we really have to recognise that although getting to zero global disarmament is a long way away, the risks of a nuclear exchange, through sheer system error, human error, cyber sabotage, and everything that we know can go wrong, those risks are absolutely enormous. And we just do have to get serious about nuclear arms control. And I don't think we should give up on China in that respect. It's always had a minimal deterrence posture. It's always had a no first use posture. Maybe some of its current actions, maybe the missile sites that it's now building in Western China indicate that it's going to move away from that. But, if you believe the worst about the other side, it very often becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So take China at its word as a country that's as a nuclear weapon state that's traditionally had a less enthusiastic posture in relation to nuclear weapons than almost anyone else. Take it at its word and try and find that common ground. That's the way to move forward, and I think we do have to be constantly saying that to the US if we are going to be able to live with it in the present environment.
By the way, there is a public announcement. If you have any questions, please be ready to raise your questions from the floor as well as online. online you can send your questions and comments to the organizer. Then they will be posting on the monitor. And those who are in the on the floor, you can raise your hand, and the staff will be giving you the microphone. Then you can give a question, on mic, okay? And we'll just have about 5 more minutes, conversation, and we'll turn to the floor, okay? And since you mentioned about nuclear issues, our number one security concern is North Korean nuclear issue.
Yeah.
There have been no progress at all. And then, in fact, we have been kind of outsourcing North Korean nuclear issue to the United States. And it has become kind of U.S. DPRK negotiation. But there are now some experts now arguing that there should be multilateral engagement on the North Korean nuclear issue, because the United States alone cannot solve the North Korean nuclear problem. There should be multilateral approach to North Korean nuclear problem. What is your take on that idea?
Well, I've always been supportive of the Party talks framework and a larger multilateral environment, but the reality is, as I think we all know, that the absolute key to it is the bilateral U.S.-North Korea relationship, and unless there's some ice broken on that particular front, I mean, all the goodwill in the world from the South Korean government and all the constructive engagement of the various other players in the region is just going to go to naught. I've always been, perhaps naively, an optimist about the possibility of a sustainable nuclear deal with the North. Maybe things have gone too far now to make really credible a complete denuclearization, at least for the foreseeable future. But a freeze, would be very important to achieve, and I think it's potentially on the table. Look, the reality is, as we all know, that and I think this is an absolutely fair assessment, that Kim's intentions are above all defensive rather than aggressive, that he's focused on regime survival, that he knows to be homicidal with the nuclear weapons that he has, or indeed any other weapons, is to be suicidal, that North Korea will be turned into a car park, not necessarily by a nuclear response, but by the overwhelming conventional capability that the United States and its allies have. I mean, he knows all that. He genuinely wants the kind of economic progress that will maintain his regime's credibility internally. And although his behavior can be very erratic, very difficult, I think if the other side, if the US were prepared, genuinely to put some stuff on the table, conclusion of the formal Korean War peace treaty, the kind of normalization or moves toward genuine normalization of diplomatic relations that have long been sought, and of course significant economic support as part of it too. But if there can be some incentives put on the table, not necessarily waiting for some major concession first on the other side, I think some progress could be made. The critical missing ingredient, of course, is trust, and that's been the case for years now. I was involved in the original Cato negotiations, the agreed framework going way back as Australian Foreign Minister, and I have to say I was not very happy, not only with North Korea's subsequent responses to that agreement, but also the responses of the other side, of our side, of the US. We didn't fully honour our part of that bargain, and over the years we've just continued to drag our feet. And I think if the Biden administration just sort of going on without being prepared to take some really unilateral initiatives and be much more supportive of what you and the Moon administration in South Korea has been wanting to do, then I think that the situation is just certainly not going to get any better and probably further deteriorate. So that's my take on it, for what it's worth. Again, I think, sometimes you just do have to take some risks in order to make progress, and I don't think enough risks have been taken. I'm not talking about the Trump substitute of circuses for good policy, but as you yourself have written, Chung-in, I mean, not everything in the in the Trump approach was wrong-headed. I mean, the willingness to try to find some common ground and to put something on the table was important. And I think, that approach has to be adopted in the future. But you know much more about all this stuff than I do, so I'll yield to your judgment, of course.
Okay, I'll be taking questions from the floor. Would you raise your hand? I know it is very awkward situation, but any volunteers? Please, yeah, go ahead. Would you identify yourself first?
Yes, I'm Captain Merrick. I am Canada's Defence Attaché to the Republic of Korea. I would like to compliment you gentlemen on the format of this afternoon. It really is invigorating to be part of this conversation. Thank you. One of the things that I've noticed over the last day is there's this tendency to hold the United States responsible for a lot of action. But I'm wondering, how would you hold China responsible in a similar way, thinking of arbitrary detention, for example? Thank you.
Thank you. Gareth, you answer.
Yeah, well, I'm extremely critical of all sorts of things about China's behavior. I'm extremely critical, as I mentioned in passing, to its treatment of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. I'm extremely critical of its decimation of democracy and dissent in Hong Kong, in complete breach of its treaty obligations, to quite apart from anything else. And I'm certainly critical of its over-assertiveness in the South China Sea, which I think has been in complete defiance of international law and the proper interpretation of that international law by the Hague Tribunal. And it does require, some calling out, and it does require some pushback. I think there's all sorts of criticisms of China, including many that have been made by our own government, that have been unnecessarily provocative and themselves sort of overreaching in the other direction. And, some of the Belt and Road stuff, for example, is China's behavior there, although people talk about debt traps and so on, has really been, by and large, regarded productively and favourably by those countries that are benefiting from the infrastructure investment that are involved. I mean, we don't like it in the West because it seems to give China potential strategic advantage right across Central Asia, potentially in the Indian Ocean. But that's legitimate, and some of those defences are, some of that behaviour is, being called out in an unnecessarily provocative and confrontational way. I should also say, of course, in a Canadian context, that one other huge anxieties I have about China's behaviour is its continued detention of the two Michaels, including my colleague Michael Kovrig from the International Crisis Group, which I used to run for 10 years, and I was the one that established the Crisis Group office in Beijing and negotiated the terms of our involvement there, which was entirely, totally above the board contribution to policy analysis, nothing remotely untoward. And the behaviour there, the hostage diplomacy that's been involved in the context of the Meng case, is, as you would know better than most as a Canadian, is completely indefensible. But you've got to live with these. You've got to live with these countries, and I'm an equal opportunity offender in terms of calling people out. I do call out the United States when I think it overreaches, or as I was suggesting a little while ago, in its rhetoric, which is counterproductive. I do obviously have concerns about the United States reliability post-Afghanistan, as we all do, the extent to which it will seriously put its allies' interests ahead of its own if there's a conflict. But of course, when states do behave in the way that China's increasingly behaving, you've got to call them out even-handedly and try and find a way of. Look, my approach as foreign minister to all this stuff, when I had difficulties, whether they were human rights difficulties or anything else, with another country, was to do that which was productive, to not worry too much about doing that which was unproductive, but to avoid doing that which was counterproductive. And I think whether you're talking about human rights representations or anything else, that's not a bad mantra to follow. Sometimes that does mean you rely on sort of backroom, quiet channel diplomacy. Sometimes you just have to be a bit noisier. But what we all want to do is to create solutions to these problems and not just roll over to authoritarian overreach. And it's a complicated business. There's so many different environments in which this issue arises. I mean, the whole issue of freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea is a very, very tricky one. But I've always supported the idea of not just the United States, but all of us making clear not just our commitment to freedom of commercial navigation, but also our commitment to the whole UN Conference on the Law of the Sea ground rules about navigation. And that does require, active military presence and engagement and visibility by a whole lot of us, not just the US. And if we leave it to the US, well, maybe that's we'll bear some of the consequences.
Yeah, for example, my concern is this: if you look at the spectrum of China-U.S. relations, United States studied with engagement, cooperation, competition. But since the President Trump period, it is moving into rivalry and animosity. And if United States cut off the cooperative ties, even competitive ties with China, if there is nothing but rivalry and animosity, then it is we are really concerned about that kind of relations, because U.S.-China relations is not unilinear or one-shot interaction. It is multifaceted interactions. Therefore, we hope the United States would come up with a much more refined and sensible approach to China. Yeah, China, as Gareth pointed out, China made a lot of mistakes. Whatever, we understand, but the way the U.S. handle can be more innovative and sensible, rather than going back old, Cold War rhetoric, and that is my concern. Okay, we have one. Any other questions from the floor? That was a really excellent question. Yeah, over there, yes.
Well, I'd like to offer my compliments to this engaging and very interesting exchanges back and forth. I'm Lieutenant Johan Bei from the Republic of Korea Ministry of National Defense, and I have a question. Correct me if I'm wrong, Professor Evans, in your dialogue you said something about recognizing China being a superpower and giving it some room to actually set its own rules and play its role out. But since you're from Australia, and Australia is the one who's finding itself in predicament with China for speaking out, China's human rights issues and whatnot. And when China is silencing other nations speaking out and trying to ice them out, and other countries are too scared to even speak up, how are we supposed to give them some room to actually, be the leader or be the superpower and be able to manifest themselves in the global arena? Thank you.
Gareth.
Well, I mean, this is the tricky tightrope we're all walking. I mean, when I talked about giving China some space in a global context, what I specifically said was recognize its claims to be a rule maker as well as just a rule taker. I don't mean by that unilaterally setting new international rules of behavior. I do mean by that that it's thoroughly entitled to have a more participatory role in a lot of the familiar institutions where it's been excluded from boards of governors, or where the ground rules were all written in the atmosphere of the immediate post-war world and not recognizing contemporary realities. So that's just a more general point. Look, when China overreaches, misbehaves, you've got no choice but to call it out. And, allies should be prepared to speak up when other allies are under stress, from that sort of situation. I mean, we've suffered, I think, partly as a result of our own missteps, and I've written about this at some length, but partly also because of Chinese overreach to some of the entirely legitimate concerns we've had about breaches of not just Western values, but universal values enshrined in the Declaration and the Human Rights Covenants and so on. You've just got to handle these situations in a way that reflects the complexity of the situation. When you're in a hole, stop digging is rule number one. You don't add further piles to it. Look for cooperative areas where there's potential for finding genuine common ground, and I've identified some of those. But where you've got absolutely intractable differences, you've just got to articulate them and work through them, and do it in a cooperative way with other countries in the region. I mean, I'm a little unhappy about some of the reaction to the discriminatory treatment that's been meted out to Australia in terms of trade sanctions and so on. Our economy is still doing all right because China needs our iron ore, but it doesn't need much else in terms of our commodities or our services, and it has been giving us a hard time. And we were previously by far the biggest exporter of beef, for example, into China. Now that market has dried up, but the United States producers have rushed to fill the gap, and there hasn't been much enthusiasm from Washington in trying to to talk that down. So we talk the talk about alliance solidarity and about a collective response to unconscionable behaviour, but we haven't been very good at delivering it. Not suggesting any of this is easy, but I think we ought to be trying a bit harder. And certainly, in giving China some space, I mean, in a strategic and military context, I mean, you guys are all totally familiar with these issues, but if China was hovering around, San Diego and the U.S. coastline in the way that the United States is comfortably and cheerfully wanting to hover in perpetuity, so close to the Chinese coastline in the East Asian littoral, we'd be looking at this through a different set of lenses. So, I mean, I think we do have to recognise there's some reality to the concept of strategic space as well as rule-making space. But that doesn't mean space in the human rights area to act in complete breach of universally agreed standards, and we should call them out.
One online comment. It's a comment, not the question. That is, it is great for me to join this, Seoul, defense dialogue. It is for the first time for me to join this kind of opportunity, and I believe that a lot of Korean youth do not have opportunities to join this kind of event. I hope that organizer would create a young leaders session to deal with this kind of topic, so that Korean young leaders can join this dialogue and participate in actual, discussions. Okay, and Mr. Lee, the director of International Cooperation, division, should keep that in mind.
That's right, Chung-in. They don't want just old grey hairs like us. We want the next generation up there talking about these issues, and you and I ought to be stepping back and not occupying this platform in future, but making sure that some of our interlocutors are up there.
Another question, that is, I understand the Seoul Defense Dialogue dealt with such issues as climate change and space security yesterday, and now the concept of security is changing from traditional military concept to the other concepts. On the occasion of 10th anniversary of Seoul Defense Dialogue, what kinds of new security agenda should be set at the Seoul Defense Dialogue? Gareth, what are your suggestions?
Well, I mean, I think this concept of comprehensive security is important. I mean, inevitably, with a defence-sponsored and largely, defence participating environment, the focus is going to be on the hard security issues rather than the softer ones. But as long as it's sort of part of the, and obviously new technology and implications of artificial intelligence and in the security space, the impact of hypersonics and drones and space and God knows what else, and obviously going to have to be a much broader array of hard security issues addressed in the future than may have been in the comfort zone in the past. But I would also like to see, at least in the margins of this conference, a recognition of the importance of broader human security issues, the broader economic and social policy issues that do really, determine the effectiveness of countries' capacity to both their populations to live with decency, but also to deal decently with each other. If you can create an environment that is cooperatively addressing some of those non-traditional security problems, if you can create an environment of what I call good international citizenship, and you know, get out there and debate and discuss and try and make progress cooperatively on a whole bunch of intractable social, economic, environmental issues, you are clearly contributing to lessening the risk of things going pear-shaped when it comes to you know, eventual military hostilities. All these things do feed into each other, and I do think it's important to bring that broader perspective. Yes.
I have another online question. That question is this. So defense dialogue has been focusing on the security agenda in the Asia Pacific. Which one is more desirable, just focusing on Asia Pacific or expanding the scope to the global level?
Well, some of the issues are intractably associated. I mean, the US-Russian nuclear arsenals, we're not going to make any progress on reducing nuclear arsenals in the Asia-Pacific unless you know, the US and Russia get back into serious dialogue in an environment where nuclear arms control agreements are either dead or on life support, like the New START. And so, you know, there's just an inextricable connection there, and I'd certainly like to see those sort of issues. I mean, but you know, so much of what's happening in our own Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific region is setting the agenda for the globe at the moment. There's no bigger global issue than the US-China competition and how we handle it. Absolutely no bigger global issue. So, you know, I think there's some utility in keeping the primary focus on sort of regional issues and a regional perspective. But yes, by all means, recognise the interaction and the security risks and threats that flow from some of the broader issues as well. But no, you can't do everything in these sorts of dialogue forums, and it is important to establish a niche, to have an identity, and to bring a level of expertise and sophistication to the discussions that you do have, which makes people want to attend them. And if you try to cover too much ground, too many, you know, all over the landscape, sometimes that militates against that degree of attractive engagement. But I'm not going to be any more prescriptive. I've already been far too prescriptive as an outsider about the Seoul dialogues, and I'm sure these dialogues have a great future because of the you know, the caliber of the people involved in the organization and the commitment that the South Korean government obviously has to this whole multilateral dialogue process, which is very attractive and compelling.
But I think the one agenda we should include the next year's dialogue is, you know, the Korean experience in Afghanistan. And I got an email from the General Carl Eikenberry, who was also ambassador to Kabul, and he was telling that he was ambassador to Kabul in 2010 and 2011, and he has been watching the South Korean operation in Part 1. And South Koreans have done excellent job in reconstruction of Afghanistan. And also in Operation Miracle, South Korea was the most successful in evacuating Koreans, and also those Afghanis who supported Koreans out of Kabul. Therefore, those experiences would be very, very good too. Maybe Mr. Lee, please make sure that include the Korean experience in Afghanistan, our experience in Part 1, and Operation Miracle. And also another, this will be the last question to you.
Because we've got a board meeting to go to.
Oh, yeah. Okay, anyhow.
No, the last question is fine.
Okay, if there were to be an event, an opportunity to bring China and the United States common ground and have them step back on a confrontational approach and have a cooperative approach, what event would it be? Professor Jia Qing-guo of Beijing University mentioned earlier today that the denuclearization of North Korea might bring the two superpowers together. What is your view on this? Make a very short answer.
Well, that is obviously attractive. There's a huge common interest in ensuring that North Korea doesn't career out of control. And yeah, I mean, there ought to be a much greater willingness to talk about that. But look, I keep on coming back to the big three existential issues, doing something on climate, doing something on pandemics, and don't give up on China on pandemics because of Wuhan and because of all the hassle associated with that. China has been a very good international citizen, what it did in West Africa, for example, with Ebola, and can and should be again. And again, as I've already said on the nuclear arms control issue, China has potentially the capacity to be a real force for good in terms of bringing some sanity back into that debate. And if the US was prepared to move a little bit about things like no first use and to have an engagement with China at a very high level to discuss their mutual commitment to no first use, I think that'd be a huge step forward, not only for the bilateral relationship, but for the whole globe.
Gareth, as usual, superb performance. Let us give a big applause to Professor Gareth Evans. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
자,
Pleasure to-
이것으로 이번 세션을 마치도록 하겠습니다. 감사합니다.
Thank you very much, Chairman, for the wonderful leading session. So why don't we give also the chairperson a big round of applause? Well, as mentioned, this was the perfect way to look into the achievement and also compare the SDD with other platforms as well. And as mentioned as the discussion, we would like to also welcome the young leaders to come up to the stage together to have the discussion. Well, with that, we end the special dialogue. However, at 4 p.m. Korean Standard Time, we will be having the special session number 3 entitled International Security Cooperation for Peaceful and Responsible Use of Space. So please make sure that you be back in this room beforehand as we will be starting the session at 4 o'clock. Thank you very much.